All right, a very warm welcome to One on One, right here on 89.7 Contact FM. And of those who are watching us right now via C24 app, thank you so much for joining us from wherever part of the world you are watching from. The good news is now you can even watch us via your PC and your Mac machines or devices. Just follow us on Twitter at Radio Contact FM, and of course you'll be able to get the details as to how you can be able to do that. Or you can also like us on Facebook at that is 89.7 Contact FM. My guest in studio today is none other than an independent researcher and political scientist, Fred Mutebi. Welcome to One on One, sir.
Thank you very much.
So today we're going to be talking about the issues of the just concluded African Union Summit. And of course we'll also touch on the issues of succession politics in the region. You say you're specialized mostly in matters of Uganda and Rwanda, but of course with a touch of the Great Lakes region.
Yeah.
So very quickly jumping into the matters of the day, the African leaders just met and concluded their meeting just a few days ago, and of course major things were put on the table, including the meeting of the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, the fighting of Boko Haram, among other issues, and of course the shocker was the appointment of Uncle Bob as the chairman of the African Union.
Right.
So looking at the events at this summit, what were the key takeaways for you? And do you feel that the continent is actually on the right track, basing on the things that were talked about there?
You know, it's very difficult to talk about Africa in terms of whether, as a continent, it's on the right track. There are many countries in Africa which are doing very badly. And there are many countries that are doing reasonably well, and a few that are doing very well. So summing it up in one sentence is very difficult. Specifically with regard to the issues that were discussed, let me start with the issue of Robert Mugabe. Personally, I'm a bit surprised that people are making too much of
a fuss out of it.
Yeah, because...
Is it worth the noise we're making?
I don't think so. I think that there is something that people are misunderstanding. The leadership of the African Union is rotational. Inevitably, Robert Mugabe had to become chairman at some point because he is the president of Zimbabwe. Now, the only way that he could be passed over is if he wasn't president of Zimbabwe. Now, fellow presidents have no grounds for saying, you know what, Mugabe, you can't take this
because
position.
of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what is it that happens in Zimbabwe that doesn't happen elsewhere? So I think that, again, we are being led by Western media, because I've heard the BBC and all these other Western media houses really hyping this. And Africans, we've, as usual, seized on it and started parroting what we hear Western journalists saying. The thing is very simple. Whatever your objections of what Robert Mugabe does in Zimbabwe, this position is rotational. And once it became Zimbabwe's turn, Robert Mugabe had to take it. There was no two ways about it.
So at the end of the day, because the noise is surrounding the track record, basically, this is what those who are reporting it or making noise about it are saying, of Zimbabwe, the leadership style of Robert Mugabe, who they have claimed has clung onto power. You know, for all these years, some saying that he's been, I'm twisting the opposition not to take over power. And then there is also his position on what the West says about Africa and his particular country. And so leaving the question of what reputation does it give to the institution that is the African Union when it comes to relations with other bodies that involve the Western countries, like the European Union, for example. How will then this institution work with these ones when some of those Western countries have banned Mugabe from visiting their countries?
Yeah, but you see, Western governments or the European Union does not decide who is president of Zimbabwe. they don't decide who sits in these meetings in the African Union. They don't decide what specific African presidents think of them. So Robert Mugabe's view is not necessarily the view of the other presidents. But Robert Mugabe, if Westerners believe in freedom of speech, as they always tell us they do, they should let Mugabe say what he wants to say about them.
And do what he wants to,
Absolutely.
to do.
They say they say whatever they want to say about him. It's only fair that he should say what he wants about them. Because if they say, look, freedom of speech is sacrosanct in their own countries, why do they want to muzzle Robert Mugabe? The other thing is this whole notion of Mugabe clinging to power. And you know, the problem is, I think that we Africans are not thinking very deeply about ourselves. There is no country in the world that is led by one person. Robert Mugabe doesn't run Zimbabwe alone. Robert Mugabe runs Zimbabwe with a whole group of other people. Now, supposing these people didn't want to run Zimbabwe with him, would he be there? He wouldn't be there. So by focusing on Robert Mugabe, we lose sight on the wider dynamics that are taking place in Zimbabwe as a country. Now, do people vote for Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe? My own sense is that they do. Because if you read carefully what is written about the opposition in Zimbabwe, people don't trust them. And let's try to trace backwards and get a sense of why people don't trust the opposition in Zimbabwe. Because the question over which Zimbabwe fell out with the Western world was the question of land. Now, the British promised that they would fund land reform in Zimbabwe, which would entail the government buying land from white farmers who actually stole it, or they were the descendants of people who stole this land from Africans. The British said, look, we will give the Zimbabwe government money to compensate these people and then redistribute the land. Now, the opposition was against land reform. Now, Robert Mugabe took the steps that he took because the British reneged on the promise they made. Now, Zimbabweans wanted this to happen in great numbers. By the opposition opposing it and aligning itself with Western powers, it won the mistrust of Zimbabweans. And this is why Zimbabweans have been voting for Robert Mugabe. And don't forget that Western countries then came up with a regime change agenda in Zimbabwe. They wanted to remove Mugabe by hook or crook. Now, if what Mugabe was doing was popular with a large number of Zimbabweans, and Westerners wanted to remove him for doing exactly what Zimbabweans wanted him to do, the opposition was not going to become popular with those people. So I think that there is a certain tendency to oversimplify what is happening in Zimbabwe and reduce it to Robert Mugabe. It's much wider.
But what they say is that, you know, at the end of the day, whether you say that he doesn't govern the nation himself, but there are those who claim that the power he has surpasses even these other people that he runs the government with. And therefore, he's able to single-handedly do a few things. Those who accuse him saying that, you know, he uses the Electoral Commission to do things in his own favor. So how then do we justify the fact that he's not running things, he's not doing things, you know, like a one-man affair?
Yeah, but you see, if you speak to Zimbabweans, they'll tell you that the situation in Zimbabwe is not as bad as
it's being reported
in the media. You live in Rwanda, like I do much of the time. Is the situation here really, does it bear resemblance to what you hear on Western radios or what you read in Western media? Rwanda is portrayed as a country that is full of violence and human rights violations and what have you. If you listen to what is being said about Rwanda and you've never been here and you're listening from some distant place, you don't want to come here. Does it reflect what you know about Rwanda? So I think that there is a great deal of exaggeration. I'm not claiming that Robert Mugabe is a very good president or that he's a saint. He's not. He has his weaknesses, as all African presidents do, or at least the majority of them. But there is a tendency for Western media, for Westerners to oversimplify very complex situations. Now, the reason why Mugabe is not leaving power is because ZANU-PF as a political organization is very powerful, much more powerful than the opposition. They are able to mobilize support or even buy it if you want. And that means that they are always going to be able to defeat the opposition. Until the opposition convinces Zimbabweans who vote for Mugabe that it's the wrong thing to do. They will continue to lose. And look at what they do. They fight among themselves. So the dynamics internally within Zimbabwe are very, very complicated. And I think that we Africans should be making an effort to understand Zimbabwe rather than jump on these bandwagons that are driven around by Westerners who are simplifying the situation, because they are interested in distorting the reality in Zimbabwe. Because what is Mugabe doing in Zimbabwe? Mugabe is depriving land of white farmers. Where did they buy it from? They stole it. Their ancestors stole it.
Land grabbing.
Granted, they have gone on, Mugabe and his friends in ZANU-PF have gone on and allocated themselves large pieces of land, which is problematic. But that, for me, is an issue for Zimbabweans, not for me.
Not for you. I see us already jumping into the succession politics, but then we'll go deeper into that. But before we go there are statements that he said when he was taking over, and some statements that have been quoted in several media houses. Where he says that he will defeat the Boko Haram, he will deal with the ICC issue, and many other things that he mentioned. But then now, looking at the realistic point of view, looking at his age now, 90 years going to 91, and then all this time that he has been in power, but we still had some of these problems there. Do you feel that his speech or the things that he said are realistic in any way? Do you feel that he's able to do that?
He's not able to do it. I think he would like to do it. It doesn't depend on him as Mugabe as a person. It doesn't even depend on Zimbabwe. Defeating Boko Haram is going to take much greater effort than Zimbabwe alone can muster. It will take an effort from several African governments, or even from the African Union itself. And we don't know how this is going to happen. Now, if you speak to people working at the African Union, they'll tell you discussing Boko Haram within the African Union is a very sensitive thing to do, because Nigeria doesn't want it to be discussed.
Why? Why would they not want it to be discussed?
The government of Nigeria has a view of itself as very powerful. So it doesn't want to be portrayed as incompetent.
As weak, incompetent to deal with Boko Haram.
And unable to defeat Boko Haram. The reality of the matter is they are unable to do it. I understand that there are governments or even African presidents who have volunteered to send forces to Nigeria if Nigeria would mobilize the required resources to enable them to send troops so that their troops can operate there. Nigeria hasn't been able to do that. Why? We don't know. Now, is Robert Mugabe going to change that? I really don't know. If he will, good luck to him, and that will be very good for Nigeria. But I don't think that he alone can actually change this. It's going to take much more collective effort.
Could there then be business around it? Because people say that where there is war, sometimes there are people who always are benefiting. And looking at the Boko Haram situation, where you even say that the Nigerian government seems not to be willing to be assisted to deal with this issue, from your own research and analysis, do you feel that someone somewhere in Nigeria or the government, the federal government, is benefiting from this war?
I don't know the specifics enough for me to be able to take a position on it. But what you said is, indeed, it's said that every war has its own beneficiaries. Now, are there people in Nigeria benefiting? I really don't know. But going by other conflicts in Africa, I think that can also be one of those cliches that people throw around without having any specific information. Now, when M23 was fighting the DRC government in 2012, we were told that they were fighting because they were trading in minerals and so on and so forth. The evidence is very thin. As far as we know, if you look carefully, these people are fighting for much higher goals than just robbing minerals or trading in minerals. So with Boko Haram, I would love to know the specifics, but I'm not going to endorse these claims just because somebody has said it.
So.
I don't know enough to be able to take a position.
We will try our own people. Leave us alone, we will try our own people. This is one of those statements that also Mugabe mentioned in reference to the ICC, and he also challenged the Western nations. How would would you feel if we told some of your leaders to come and be tried by an African court? Would you accept? Would you do it? Are we going the right direction based on the fact that, yes, we want to be independent as a continent and do our own things, find our own local solutions to our problems?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, do we have the capacity, do we have the trust from the people to try our leaders who may violate the rights of their own citizens?
Personally, I'm a little skeptical. I'm skeptical not because I don't think that we can trust that could happen, but I think that the bigger questions that pose themselves is, how is this court going to be constituted? Who is going to fund it? Because the African Union itself is funded, 3/4 of their budget comes from the Western world. African governments are not able to fund the African Union. Here in the East African community, we are struggling to fund the EAC.
The EAC, exactly.
ECOWAS does a lot better than us. Now, yeah, good intentions, but are we going to put our money where our mouths are, or are we just going to talk about it? And I haven't really understood why African governments are very fond of setting up these shells, which they don't fund, which they don't actually enable to function. That's where my problem is. And I wish it could happen. Because personally I have problems with outfits like the ICC. Now the ICC, theoretically speaking, could be a very good thing, but the ICC has a problem. The problem is that it has concentrated on trying or demonizing African leaders. And I'm not saying this because I want to protect them, but there is a question there that we Africans should not run away from. Are African presidents the only people who have violated human rights across the world? The answer is no. Now, if they are not the only ones, why are they the only ones that are being focused on? Does it make this court fair, or does it make it one-sided? They are targeting, African presidents.
But they were not forced. They were not forced to do it. These nations signed onto the Rome Statute.
Indeed,
they were not forced to do it.
Indeed, they did. And I think that, again, it's one of those things where we Africans sometimes jump on bandwagons whose implications we don't understand. And here, I always salute the government of Rwanda. Rwanda never signed up. And I always think, what makes Rwandans so smart as to see through some of these things and others not to be able to do it? The Rwandans said, no, we are not signing up because this court is problematic. Now, the Musevenis who rushed to sign, the Kenyans who rushed to sign, they are now looking back and regretting.
I'm saying we want a mass pullout.
Absolutely, and I think a mass pullout would be good, but it wouldn't answer the question of what is the alternative. For me, I don't believe in these in claims made by many African intellectuals and elites that, this court is going to stop impunity and so on and so forth. We Africans should be responsible for stopping impunity on our own continent and not trying to borrow other people's solutions, or not trying to borrow other people to come and do what we should do.
What we should do ourselves.
We want democracy, we want accountability. We are not prepared to take the risks that are required to make sure that we get those things. We always want to sort of outsource them to Westerners who can set up courts in their own countries where they can ship our leaders to go and be tried there. And then suddenly we say, but hang on, what are these people doing? So I think that there is need for very deep reflection on a very wide range of matters by us Africans. And I think that African intellectuals, African universities, African think tanks have abdicated their responsibility to apply themselves to actually thinking about these things and how they can happen.
Because at the end of the day, we also tend to wonder, are meetings like this ones, like the African Union Summit, just other talking shops where people go, we have these big statements, we have these photo sessions, but then when the leaders get back to their countries, it's business as usual, because there are people who are analyzing and saying African problems are in Addis discussing African issues. So they claim that these leaders who are there are actually the problem of Africa. These are the ones who have, decided not to focus on development, but let corruption thrive in their own countries individually at different levels. They are the ones who have deprived some of their citizens the right to access certain key, basic needs. So when these leaders or some of these leaders are being mentioned as the problem of Africa, then where are we heading?
Well, I think that unfortunately we don't have any possibilities of borrowing leaders from elsewhere.
They will be ours, whether they're good or bad.
Will always come from here. Now, I don't know if one could use an example. I mean, again, let's go to Robert Mugabe. People say, Robert Mugabe is a bad leader, and no, isn't it a pity that Zimbabwe doesn't have a better leader? Why can't Zimbabweans remove him? I mean, why? What is it that makes Mugabe able to stay if Zimbabweans don't like him? Or do Zimbabweans like him and we misunderstand it? Now, which other leaders are problems? I think that our leaders in many ways reflect the state of our socio-economic political development. Leaders who allow corruption to thrive, do they allow it because they think it's a good thing, or are they just incapable of tackling it for some reason? Or maybe they don't have the skills, or the contextual setup in which they are operating makes it difficult. Some leaders, of course, corruption serves their political interests if you want to stay in power.
Yes.
And the only way you're going to be able to do it is to allow some people to steal money from the public.
Yes.
Then that's what you do, because that's what you will need to do to stay in power. Now, if the people you govern don't like it, it can't be beyond them to find a solution. I think that the way our leaders behave, for the most part, reflects our own understanding of politics. It reflects our own values. It reflects our own ideas about what leadership is about. We can't just blame our leaders. Our leaders are single individuals.
And we are the ones who actually even put them there.
Yes, Kabila is a single person running a huge country full of people, full of very educated people who speak very good French, who dress very nicely, but they didn't turn around and start moaning about Kabila.
But something interesting I realized about that is when we're having elections at different countries, I'll give a practical example of Kenya, for example. This is a debate that was there at some point during the election period, that we have people who are just, they vote on Twitter and social media networks. They never take part in the actual voting process. They will always be the ones there giving analysis, talking, saying this, saying that, what we need, blah, blah, blah. But you will never find them queuing to take the initiative of voting. And most of the time, the people who vote are the ones who are in the villages and probably, at the end of the day, leading to the fact that we don't have the kind of leaders that probably are at the level of these people that you're saying speak good French, wear nice suits. What do we do then? So that these people really take part in the actual voting and stop just making noise on Twitter, using hashtags and all that.
I think that those of us who do those sorts of things should wake up and do what we need to do. There's this saying that I come across several times. I don't know who the originator is, that be the change you want to be. Now, if you don't like your president and you think he's a bad president, go and vote for somebody else. Now, these elites that don't vote, they don't vote. Let me talk about Uganda. Museveni has been winning elections repeatedly since the restoration of multi-party politics in 2005. Now, there are Ugandans, and there are many, who will tell you they are tired of Museveni. If they're tired of him, why don't they go and vote him out? When it comes to elections, they don't go there. So they create space for Museveni's supporters, Museveni's committed supporters, to go and vote for him.
Exactly.
Now, after that, they complain. They say, the election was rigged. The election was rigged, but you didn't participate. And also, of course, the claims we make about rigging are neither here nor there, because there are ways in which you can demonstrate that actually the vast majority of people who go out to vote are those who want Museveni to stay. Those who don't want him to stay
never partake to the voting process.
Those who don't care don't vote, which means that the conditions inside Uganda are such that they allow Museveni to stay in power. So we Ugandans allow him to stay in power by our behavior, either by going out to elect him or by not going to vote at all. Yes, and therefore, so it's not his fault.
Probably sometimes also there's a point of options, which brings us to the talk of on succession politics, where you find people like Museveni probably, or in such a context, the people who are supposed to vote probably just feel like we have no other choice. choice. We have no other option. There's no one else. So at the end of the day, okay, we'd rather just go with the devil we know than the angel we don't know. So do you feel that some of these leaders take advantage of this by not preparing successors, by not molding people who, you know, they can say, okay, no matter what happens, at some point, this is the kind of person that I'd like to take over. It is my opinion, you can decide. We saw this happen with the former President Daniel Moi in Kenya, when he openly anointed the current president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta.
After how many years?
It took some time, yes, but he sort of started molding someone who today is the president of Kenya. Do you think that this is the right direction? That President Paul Kagame should stand somewhere and say, I anoint this one, this is my preferred successor. Museveni does the same, Mugabe does the same. Would this be a solution?
I think it would be good if it happened, but let's not forget the question of timing. When should it happen, if it happens at all? Who should decide when it happens? Because for one thing is we like saying, you know what, we don't like leaders choosing leaders for us. We should be the ones choosing them. After that, we say, you know what, the president should show us who they want.
Who they want, yes.
So what do we want? And anyway, I think that people who sit on top of governments, presidents who sit there, they see a lot more than we do. So it could be, now you can say Mugabe or Museveni are deluded in hanging on for too long, but it could be that they haven't yet been convinced, rightly.
That there's someone else who can...
There is somebody around them who they can trust with running the country.
Doesn't that portray you as a bad leader? Because as a leader, some people say, this is also cliche, this is what we read, that a good leader is the one that delegates and molds others, so that when they're not there, things still run, but not the kind of leader who wants to create a situation where you only believe that it is only him who can be able to do things the way they want.
I don't think that people do create that situation. We in Uganda don't believe, for instance, that President Museveni is the only person who can run the country, necessarily. What some of us believe is that it will be good for him to go. But then we ask, and then what? Who is there? Who can we see? Who can take over from him? Opposition parties are terribly divided. There is not a single opposition party in Uganda whose leader has complete acceptability within the party. You get one faction supporting the leader, another faction fighting to throw him out. Opposition parties have been talking for years about the necessity of them coming together to form a united front against President Museveni. They have failed to do it. They have convened meetings in which they go and quarrel among themselves and then they break apart. They haven't been able to actually come out and convince Ugandans that if Museveni left, there is going to be continuity. And when we are talking of continuity, Ugandans mean very simple things. Will the country continue to be stable so that they can sleep in peace and wake up the following day and
investments continue being poured into the economy? Will
they risk too much by allowing him to go? So there is no unanimity around that question. So Ugandans who are not yet sure that if he goes, things will continue as they are.
Will continue voting for Museveni. Do you see the same picture happening, for example, for the Rwandan situation?
The Rwandan situation is...
How do you see it playing out, the succession battle?
The situation is very different from the situation in Uganda. Let me say it's very different from other contexts in the Great Lakes region. Rwanda is the only country where we have a government that is constituted by several political parties. Now, people who live outside of here think that the RPF runs Rwanda on its own. It doesn't. The RPF runs this country in collaboration with other political organizations.
Yes.
So what you have here, what we may characterize as politics of consensus. Now, I think that what is going to happen in Rwanda will depend partly, first of all, on what President Kagame wants to do himself, but also partly on what Rwandans want him to do, and also what the political organizations that are collaborating in this government want him to do. I think there is going to be a discussion around it, and what decision is going to be made eventually, I really can't predict. But for me, I don't agree with anybody who thinks that somehow if he stays, it will be because he has imposed himself or because he has manipulated the population. I haven't seen signs of manipulation, at least yet. I haven't seen them. the people I speak to in the course of my research suggest to me that there is a great dilemma around this question. Should he go or should he not?
Yes.
There are many Rwandans who are very fearful of the risks that would be entailed in President Kagame leaving. There are many Rwandans who think it would be good if he left because then it would portray Rwanda in a good light, but then they pause and think, yeah, but what if he goes and things fall apart again? So I think that the debate here is complex. And I think that we who don't live here, who are not part of this process, should be a little modest in passing judgment or in jumping to conclusions. For me, my hope is that Rwandans will be able to resolve it in ways that will serve their collective interests. But I will not discuss Rwanda in the same way I'm going to discuss
Zimbabwe or Uganda. Very different context.
They're very different.
So in two scenarios, if President Kagame will stay. This is scenario one. What then should we be focusing on in terms of the succession battle? Scenario two: if he will decide to say, whether you want me to stay, whether the constitution changes, I will go. What then should we be doing right now?
Well, you know, that's a very difficult question. If he chooses to stay, I think that Rwanda will carry on the way it is, because I don't see many things happening in this country that Rwandans seem to be terribly unhappy about. I see that Rwandans are, generally speaking, happier than the rest of us. When you go to Uganda, you'll hear loads of complaints about our government and how it's incompetent and how it fails to do many elementary things. If you go to Tanzania, complaints all over the place about Kikwete and how ineffectual he has been and what a bad president he has been. If you go to Kenya, Kenyans are divided. Some think Uhuru is doing very well, others
feel it's PR.
If you go to Burundi, it's despondency there. You don't get that here. So I think that for me, I wouldn't worry too much about what happens if he stays. But I think that the question that will still confront Rwandans if President Kagame doesn't leave is, what do they do eventually? Because the question will remain on the table. The question of succession mechanisms for the long term, because one day he will go. Now, if he decides to go, I think it's going to be a big task, not just for the RPF, but for the RPF's political partners, who are the other parties participating in government, but also the other parties that are members of the National Forum of Political Organizations, because I think that this question will be discussed by all of them. It's going to be a big task for them to decide what happens. And as of now, I haven't had that discussion happen. So, and I'm very keen to see
what happens. Yeah. In closing, we have a question here on Twitter from Minega, who says, is Africa's failure to fund Africa's contingents due to lack of resources or rather lack of will? He's asking for thoughts.
I don't think it's lack of resources. And I don't think it's lack of will. I think well, what does will describe or define? Is it that people have no interest in doing it? I think that some countries may have no interest in doing it. Some countries may not see the benefit for themselves of doing it. Some countries may have other priorities. Scarce resources, big priorities. What do you choose first? Do you fund the AU or do you fund healthcare in your own country? Do you fund the AU or do you fund your army? So I think it's a combination of all those things. But I would like to believe that if there was, if it was urgent, and I think that here really the key issue is urgency. If it was urgent for African governments to organize these things, they would happen.
Super. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Fred, for being with us on One-on-One. Very great insights over there. And of course, we are also keenly watching on these issues, and we hope that the platform that is One-on-One and others will definitely offer you a chance to come and share more insights on these issues.
My pleasure.
There you have it. One-on-One comes to an end. My guest today, independent researcher and political scientist Fred Mutebi, right here on One-on-One. More discussions and debates, and even better, on different issues that shape the news agenda in Rwanda and the region and the rest of the world. Find them right here on Contact on One-on-One. Let's keep the discussions going. The hashtag to use is 101RW. My name, as always, is Eugene Anangwe. Goodbye for now.